All right, so like I said in the intro video, we're going to talk about three main branches of ethical theory. And the first one we're going to be addressing is consequentialism. So, put very briefly, very succinctly, consequentialist moral theories argue that what makes an action right or wrong, morally right or wrong, that is, depends on its consequences. And so there's something that is sort of intuitively appealing about these theories, and they sort of track with a very common feeling that a lot of people have that what is the best thing to do or the most right thing to do is whatever leads to the most desirable outcome. And so in this way, it's a very future-oriented branch of theory. But there are different brands of consequentialism or different ways of maybe understanding how we should take consequences into account or whose consequences for who is also another important question. But the most well-known or sort of archetypal, paradigmatic example of consequentialist theory is that of utilitarianism. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this module, because when you hear people talk about consequentialism in philosophy, generally they're talking about utilitarianism or a theory that's very closely related to and sort of inspired by utilitarianism. So utilitarianism started, people think, with Jeremy Bentham, who was a British reformer, social reformer, and legal scholar. And so he's often credited with a piece that he published in 1789 with starting utilitarianism. And he was very concerned with, like I said, he was a legal scholar. He was very concerned with public policy. And so he argued in this 1979 piece that utility should be the guiding principle for both individual action and for social policies and laws that would be put into place. Okay, so what is meant by utility? I'm saying utilitarianism. What do we mean by utilitarianism? By utility, especially as Bentham discusses it. So Bentham is what we now call a classical utilitarian. And what these classical utilitarians mean when they speak of utility is related to pleasure and pain, or happiness and pain. So an act has the most utility, it has the highest utility when it brings about the greatest net happiness or net pleasure. And an act is lower in utility or has low utility when it tends to bring about more pain and less happiness or pleasure than another act could have. So this classical utilitarianism is called hedonic act utilitarianism. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. But this is because we are concerned with the individual acts themselves. So not like a rule for action, but just like what are the consequences of that single act. So that's where we get act utilitarianism. And we're also concerned with the consequences in a very particular way. So we're concerned with the consequences insofar as they give us more or less hedonically valuable outcomes. And hedonism is a word that is not just used in philosophy, but it's an ancient philosophical, it sort of started as like an ancient philosophical theory, which says that the only thing that is really intrinsically valuable, meaning valuable for its own sake, is pleasure. And the only thing that is intrinsically bad, meaning bad in and of itself, is pain. And so things that we do are for the sake of pleasure. And things that we avoid are for the sake of avoiding pain. So like if you buy a new car that goes really fast or is really, really reliable or has some other good-making quality, the reason that it is good is because it maximizes your pleasure in that situation and minimizes like your likelihood of maybe breaking down on the side of the highway in the hot Arizona heat, something like that. Okay, so long story short, put in very basic terms, utilitarianism says that the morally right action is the action that brings about the greatest happiness or pleasure. And it's important to note that it's not, unlike buying like a car for just yourself, maybe you're not even concerned with maybe you're not thinking of that as a moral decision, but it's important to note that utilitarianism is not just focused on the individual or even on the perspective of one individual. So it's a collective account of happiness. It's not just like what brings about the greatest happiness for me, what sounds most fun or pleasurable to me. It's about what brings about the greatest happiness total, like in the world. And so one slogan that's often associated with utilitarianism is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So any person, or in some cases, any sentient being, so there are some consequentialists who, like Peter Singer, who argue for like in the theory of animal ethics, or just kind of expanding our circles of moral concern. But any person, or sometimes any sentient being, that can experience pleasure or experience pain matters in deciding whether or not an action is right or wrong. And why do they matter? They matter because they are at work in determining how valuable the outcome is. So they are under consideration, essentially. Okay, so according to this theory, we care about total consequences, right? But we also care about actual consequences. So what really matters when we're deciding if an act was right or wrong or good or bad is the real outcomes of the act. It doesn't matter whether someone intended for an act to go well. They really like maybe you buy someone a gift and you really intend it as a nice gesture, but actually you didn't know that this particular item is really offensive to them, or it's like connected to a really, really bad memory for them. And so actually it causes them a lot of suffering. And the utilitarians are going to say, the classical utilitarians are going to say, okay, well, that was bad for you to do that, even though you had really positive intentions. And also, it doesn't matter what the expectations are. So related to intentions are our expectations. So when we're deciding whether or not to act in a particular way, we're trying our best to think, if we're a utilitarian, we're going to do our best to think, okay, is this going to lead towards the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, essentially the greatest total amount of happiness. But if we act thinking we've done our best to figure it out, but if we act and it doesn't provide the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, it doesn't maximize utility, then the classical utilitarian is still going to say you acted wrongly. And so these are two areas where some of the primary critiques of consequentialism or utilitarianism come into play, because it can be really difficult to know whether an action is going to lead to the best possible outcomes with any kind of certainty. And it can also be really difficult to measure the total consequences of an action to decide whether it really did produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And so you have the questions of how do we measure it? How do we actually calculate whether this act has done what we want it to do according to this theory? And also, is it able to be action guiding is a question, because we want our moral theories to tell us how to act and to be a useful tool to allow us to navigate our worlds. But if it's the case that we just completely miss the mark and we can't really anticipate or accurately consider whether our actions are going to have these particular consequences, then it isn't really an action guiding theory. And so some of these, this is sort of a family of a couple critiques that are often levied against consequentialism. Okay, so that's a pretty quick rundown of what we're talking about when we talk about consequentialism and also utilitarianism, which is like really the main, like I said, most important theory that uses a consequentialist framework. And there might have been a lot of terminology or new ideas that I've sort of tossed at you. But if you have any questions, as always, reach out to me via email. I'm happy to discuss it further. We won't be reading Jeremy Bentham's work in this module, but I'm happy to recommend things related to that if you're interested, because he has a lot to say about the specifics about what makes something, about how we should evaluate pleasure and pain, and what are the sort of features that make that are important here. Okay, so in the next videos and readings for this module, we'll be discussing John Stuart Mill, who is sort of a successor of Bentham and is also credited as being one of the foundational figures, one of the most important figures within utilitarianism. And we will also read a more recent piece by Peter Singer. I mentioned him earlier when I was talking about people arguing for sentient beings, not just humans, deserving moral considerations because they can experience pleasure and pain. Singer is one of the people who do this. We're going to read a piece of his that's tracks in a little bit of a different area, but it's still really a very, very famous piece. He is a contemporary philosopher who's still living and working, but you will get to those soon.